Mr. Bryce, since you're from Texas, I want to ask you a little bit about Texas and specifically the current interconnection applications for the ERCOT grid.
Sure.
I was looking at those, and I noticed that right now it seems there's about 100 gigawatts of solar projects seeking interconnection, about 42 gigawatts of battery storage, over 22 gigawatts of wind. So if you look at the entirety of the queue in Texas, about 93% of it is solar, wind, and battery storage. You mentioned sort of a upwelling of, I don't know, an uprising against wind and solar. So why is Texas hell-bent on becoming the biggest solar and renewables market in the U.S.?
The answer, sir, is very clear. Excessive subsidies for solar and wind. I reported in Forbes a few months ago, the subsidy via the investment tax credit for solar is 250 times what is given to nuclear, and it's 160 times greater for wind as it is for nuclear. The Texas market and the investment in the Texas market is being driven by subsidies, full stop.
I think we can all agree that there are massive subsidies throughout the energy markets. There are subsidies for oil and gas. There are certainly subsidies with respect to insurance for nuclear, and there are subsidies for renewables. But let's look at real quick just at the levelized cost, because I think what's happening in Texas is more an indication of where price trends have gone over time. So if you look at electric generation today, and you take all the subsidies out, you just look at the levelized cost, you see how incredibly expensive nuclear has become. You see how expensive coal is today. You see how expensive natural gas, particularly peaker plants, and even combined cycle natural gas plants have become more expensive than wind and solar on a levelized basis. So I think what we're seeing in Texas is a reflection of the free market and the fact that people do want cheap energy and they want reliable energy. And Texas has moved in the direction they have because of these costs in particular. You know, when you have nuclear at a price that is over 3 times what you can get for wind and solar generation, you're going to see migration in the market. Mr. Gould, I want to ask you, obviously we're seeing, you know, escalating prices in volatile commodities, gasoline, diesel, natural gas. You talk a little bit about the role of heat pumps in cushioning customers away from some of those price shocks. But more broadly, isn't it electrification, and specifically electrification reliant on low-cost sources like we've seen in those Nordic countries, that is cushioning some Europeans and not others?
Yeah, I would concur with that. Certainly with the part to say that as a result of policy support, a sort of virtuous circle of policy support and deployment, key renewable technologies in the power sector are now the least cost options for new generation. And that is why they are now the preferred source of technologies for new investment. And that plays through into this notion of clean electrification of parts of the economy, notably for mobility and for heating in some instances. In our view, some analysis we did in the World Energy Outlook shows that if you are able to make the upfront investments in more efficient appliances and in electrification of mobility and electrification in some cases of heat, that is a very effective strategy for cushioning the effects of commodity price shocks on consumers.
So, Mr. Gould, walk us through just a couple of examples. If you look at Europe, obviously some of these countries have gotten it right and some have gotten it wrong. What should we learn from the countries that have done a better job, and what should we avoid in some of the countries that have seen the most extreme price shocks?
I think part of the change that's taking place in Europe is away from a system that is heavily dependent on operational costs, on fuel costs, more towards a system that is reliant on technologies that may have higher upfront costs, but then have much lower operating expenditures. And the further you move down that road, the less vulnerable you are to then fluctuations in the prices of those fuels. And I would point indeed to some of the Nordic countries who seem to have weathered the price storm better than others in Europe as good examples of what can be achieved.